Dante had been holding it in for days, maybe weeks if he was being honest with himself, the kind of secret that doesn't just sit quietly in your mind but claws at the edges of your thoughts, demanding to be let out at the worst possible moment. And as he stood in Anita's living room, watching the late afternoon light stretch across the polished floor, he realized there would never be a right time to say it. Only a moment where the truth finally outweighed the consequences. And Anita, perceptive as ever, could already tell something was off, her arms folded not in anger, but in that careful, measured patience she reserved for moments when she knew someone was about to change everything. "Dante," she said quietly, her voice steady but edged with concern. "Whatever it is, just say it." And that was all it took, that small opening, that permission, for him to exhale the tension he'd been carrying and step into the storm he knew would follow, because this wasn't just gossip or speculation. This was about Leslie, and Leslie had a way of turning even the smallest revelation into something explosive, something that rippled through every relationship in Fairmont Crest, and Dante knew that once Anita heard this, there would be no putting it back, no pretending things were the same. "I didn't want to believe it at first," he began, his voice low, measured, as if choosing each word carefully could somehow soften the impact. "But I saw it myself." Anita's expression shifted. Instantly, not shock yet, but alertness, the kind that comes when a name like Leslie is spoken with that tone, that weight. "Saw what?" she asked, and Dante hesitated, just for a second, because saying it out loud would make it real in a way that thinking it never quite did. "Leslie, she's not who she says she is." And Anita let out a quiet breath, almost a scoff, not because she dismissed it, but because part of her had always suspected something was off. "That's not exactly breaking news," she replied, but Dante shook his head, stepping closer, his eyes locking onto hers with a seriousness that wiped away any hint of sarcasm. "No, I mean it, Anita. I found out something specific. Something she's been hiding." And now Anita's posture changed completely, her arms dropping to her sides, her attention fully on him, because she could hear it now, the difference between vague suspicion and concrete truth. "Then stop circling it and tell me," she said, more firmly this time, and Dante swallowed, the memory of what he'd seen replaying in his mind with unsettling clarity. "Leslie has been meeting someone," he said, and Anita's brow furrowed. "Meeting someone isn't exactly a crime," she pointed out, but Dante shook his head again, frustration creeping in. "Not just anyone. Someone she claimed she didn't even know." And that landed, Anita's eyes narrowing as she processed the implication. "Who?" she asked, and Dante hesitated again, because the name carried its own complications, its own history. "You're not going to like it," he warned, but Anita didn't flinch. "Try me," she said. And Dante finally said it, the name cutting through the room like a blade, and Anita's reaction was immediate, a sharp intake of breath followed by a look that was equal parts disbelief and anger. "That's not possible," she said instinctively, but Dante didn't back down. "I thought the same thing, but I followed her, Anita. I saw them together, talking like this wasn't new, like this wasn't their first meeting." And Anita turned away for a moment, pacing a few steps as she tried to reconcile what she was hearing with everything she thought she knew, because if Dante was right, it didn't just mean Leslie had lied, it meant she had been orchestrating something deliberate, something that could unravel more than just her own carefully constructed image. Why would she lie about that? Anita asked, more to herself than to Dante, but he answered anyway, because whatever she's planning, it depends on people believing she has no connection to him. And that was when the real weight of it started to settle in, Anita stopping mid-step, her mind racing through possibilities, motives, consequences. "Did anyone else see them?" she asked, turning back to him, and Dante shook his head. "Not that I know of, and I don't think she realized I was there." And Anita nodded slowly, already thinking ahead, already strategizing, because that was who she was, someone who didn't just react but calculated. "Then we're the only ones who know," she said, and Dante let out a breath. "For now," he added, and Anita's gaze sharpened. "You're sure about what you saw?" she pressed, needing that certainty before she took another step, and Dante didn't hesitate this time. "I'm sure," he said firmly, and the conviction in his voice left no room for doubt, and Anita leaned back against the table. Behind her, the polished surface cool against her palms as she considered the implications, because Leslie had always been unpredictable, but this suggested something deeper, something more calculated than anyone had given her credit for. "This changes things," Anita said quietly, and Dante nodded. "That's why I had to tell you," he replied, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence thick with the understanding that whatever came next would not be simple, would not be contained. Because secrets like this had a way of spreading, of touching lives that seemed completely unrelated until suddenly they weren't, and Anita finally broke the silence, her voice steady but laced with determination. "We need to find out what she's planning," she said, and Dante felt a mix of relief and apprehension, because telling Anita meant he wasn't carrying this alone anymore, but it also meant action, and action meant consequences. "And if we're wrong?" he asked, not because he doubted what he'd seen, but because he understood the risk of acting on it, and Anita met his gaze without hesitation. "Then we deal with that," she said. "But if we're right, and we do nothing, we could be letting her get away with something that hurts a lot of people." And Dante couldn't argue with that. Not when the image of Leslie laughing softly with someone she'd sworn she had no connection to kept replaying in his mind. Not when the ease between them suggested a history, an understanding that didn't just appear overnight. "There's more," he admitted suddenly, and Anita's eyes flicked back to him. "More?" she echoed, and Dante nodded, his jaw tightening slightly. "I heard part of their conversation," he said, and Anita straightened, every instinct telling her this was the piece that would tie everything together. "What did they say?" she asked, and Dante exhaled slowly, recalling the fragmented words, the tone, the tension beneath the surface. They were talking about timing, about waiting until something happens before making a move, he explained, and Anita's mind immediately began connecting dots. "What kind of move?" she pressed, and Dante shook his head. "They didn't say exactly, but it sounded planned, like they've been coordinating this for a while." And Anita felt a chill run through her, because that suggested intent, premeditation, something far more dangerous than a simple lie. "And you're sure it was Leslie?" she asked again, almost reflexively, and Dante gave a small, incredulous laugh. "I'd recognize her anywhere," he said, and Anita nodded, more to herself than to him. "Of course you would," she murmured, and then she pushed off the table, her posture shifting from contemplation to decision. "We need proof," she said, and Dante frowned slightly. "Proof?" he repeated, and Anita nodded. "If we're going to confront her, or anyone else, we can't go on just what you saw and heard. We need something solid." And Dante understood that, even if part of him wanted to act immediately, to confront Leslie and demand answers. "So, what are you suggesting?" he asked, and Anita's expression hardened just slightly, a sign that she was already steps ahead. "We watch, we listen, and we don't let her know we're onto her," she said, and Dante felt a knot form in his stomach, because that meant staying close to someone who might be hiding something dangerous. "And if she figures it out?" he asked, and Anita met his concern with calm resolve. "Then we'll deal with that too," she said, and there it was again, that certainty, that willingness to step into uncertainty because doing nothing was worse, and Dante nodded slowly, realizing that telling Anita hadn't just been about sharing a secret, it had set something in motion, something that would inevitably draw them deeper into whatever Leslie was planning. And as the light in the room began to fade, replaced by the softer glow of evening, the weight of what lay ahead settled over them both, unspoken but undeniable, because in Fairmont Crest, secrets never stayed buried for long, and when they surfaced, they had a way of changing everything. The quiet that followed Dante's confession didn't last long, because Anita was never the kind of person who allowed uncertainty to linger without direction. And as the last traces of daylight faded beyond the windows, she shifted from absorbing the revelation to dissecting it, her mind moving quickly through possibilities, motives, and consequences in a way that made Dante realize just how much he'd set in motion by coming here. "Start from the beginning," she said, her tone calm but precise, the kind of voice that demanded clarity without raising itself, and Dante nodded, dragging a hand across the back of his neck as he replayed the sequence of events more carefully this time. "I wasn't even looking for her," he admitted. "I was heading out of the cafe near the square, and I saw her across the street. She was supposed to be out of town, remember? That's what she told everyone." And Anita's eyes narrowed slightly at that detail, because it wasn't just the meeting that mattered, it was the lie that created the opportunity for it. Go on, she urged, and Dante continued. She kept looking over her shoulder like she didn't want to be seen, so I stayed back, just in case. I don't know, something felt off, and Anita didn't interrupt, letting him speak, letting him build the picture fully. She walked 2 blocks down, then turned into that side entrance by the old offices, the one people barely use anymore, he said, and Anita immediately knew the place he meant. Isolated enough to avoid attention, public enough to avoid suspicion. And he was already there? She asked, and Dante nodded. Yeah, like he'd been waiting, he replied, and Anita's jaw tightened just slightly, because that suggested planning, not coincidence. They didn't hug, didn't act like it was emotional or anything, Dante added. It was businesslike, almost. And Anita let out a slow breath, absorbing that nuance, because emotional secrecy could be explained, but calculated distance pointed to something more deliberate. What about their body language? She asked, and Dante blinked, slightly surprised by the specificity, but he thought back carefully. They stood close, but not too close, like they were careful about how it might look if anyone saw them, but also like they were used to being around each other, he said, and Anita nodded slowly, filing that away. Familiar, but controlled, she murmured, and Dante gave a small nod. Exactly, he said, and Anita turned slightly, pacing again. But this time it was slower, more deliberate, her thoughts clearly aligning into something sharper. And you said you heard part of what they were saying, she prompted, and Dante exhaled. Not everything, just fragments, he said. But I heard Leslie say something about waiting until Anita makes her move. And that stopped Anita cold, her steps halting as if the floor itself had shifted beneath her. She said my name? Anita asked, her voice quieter now, but edged with something far more dangerous than surprise, and Dante nodded. Yeah, he confirmed, and the way she said it didn't sound casual. It sounded like she was counting on you to do something specific, and Anita's expression hardened, her mind now racing not just through what Leslie might be planning, but how she herself had unknowingly become a piece in it. What else? She pressed, and Dante hesitated, because this was the part that had unsettled him the most. He asked her if she was sure you'd go through with it. Dante said slowly, and she said, Anita always does what she thinks is right. That's what makes this so easy. And the silence that followed was heavier than anything before it, because this wasn't just about deception anymore. It was about manipulation, about someone studying Anita closely enough to predict her actions, to build a plan around them. And Anita's hands clenched slightly at her sides, not out of fear, but out of anger. Controlled and precise. She's using me, Anita said, more as a realization than a question, and Dante didn't sugarcoat it. It sounds like it, he replied, and Anita let out a slow breath, steadying herself, because reacting emotionally would only play further into whatever Leslie had set up. No, she said after a moment, her voice firming with resolve. She thinks she's using me. And Dante watched as something shifted in her. The initial shock giving way to strategy, to a quiet but unmistakable determination. That's a dangerous line of thinking, he cautioned, but Anita shook her head. Not if we stay ahead of her, she countered, and Dante folded his arms, considering that. And how do we do that if we don't even know the full plan? He asked, and Anita met his gaze, her eyes sharp now, focused. We make her think her plan is working, she said, and Dante frowned slightly. You mean, play along? He asked, and Anita nodded. Exactly, she replied. If she's expecting me to make a move, then I will, but on my terms, not hers. And Dante let out a breath, because that was both clever and risky. And what if her move depends on something you can't control? He pressed, and Anita didn't hesitate. Then we find out what that is before it happens, she said, and Dante ran a hand through his hair, the weight of it all pressing in again. This is bigger than we thought, he muttered, and Anita gave a small, humorless smile. It always is with Leslie, she said, and there was history in her voice now, something deeper than just this moment, something that hinted at past encounters, past suspicions that had never quite been proven until now. You've had doubts about her before, Dante observed, and Anita nodded slightly. I just never had anything concrete, she admitted, and now that we do, I'm not going to waste it. And Dante stepped closer, lowering his voice. Then we need to be careful, he said. If she's been planning this for a while, she's not going to slip up easily, and Anita agreed with a small nod. Which is why we don't confront her yet, she said. We watch, we gather more, and we figure out exactly what she's waiting for. And Dante exhaled slowly. And the person she's meeting with, he asked, what do we do about him? And Anita's expression darkened slightly. We keep an eye on him too, she said, because if he's involved, then he's just as much a part of this as she is. And Dante nodded, though unease still lingered. You realize this could blow up in ways we can't predict, he said, and Anita met that reality head-on. It already has, she replied. We just haven't seen the full impact yet. And for a moment, they stood there in the dimming light, both aware that they were stepping into something far more complex than a simple secret, something that had been carefully constructed behind the scenes, waiting for the right moment to unfold. There's one more thing, Dante added suddenly, and Anita's gaze snapped back to him. What? She asked, and Dante hesitated, because this detail had felt almost insignificant at the time, but now it seemed like it might matter more than anything else. When they finished talking, she handed him something, he said, and Anita's eyes narrowed. What kind of something? She asked, and Dante shook his head. I couldn't see clearly, it was small. Maybe an envelope or a flash drive. But whatever it was, he didn't even check it, just slipped it into his jacket. Like he already knew what it was. And Anita felt that same chill again, because that suggested trust, prearranged understanding, something that had been in motion long before Dante ever saw them. So this isn't just talk, she said quietly. There's already an exchange happening, and Dante nodded. That's what it looked like, he confirmed, and Anita turned away again, this time not pacing, but standing still, staring out into the darkened window as if trying to see beyond the reflection. Staring back at her, beyond the immediate, into the shape of what was coming. Then we're running out of time, she said finally, and Dante felt the weight of that settle in his chest. What do you want to do? He asked, and Anita didn't answer right away, because this wasn't a decision to rush, even if urgency pressed in from every side. But when she did speak, her voice carried that same quiet certainty that had been there from the beginning, now sharpened into something unbreakable. We find out what she thinks I'm going to do, she said, and then we make sure she's wrong. And Dante nodded, because at this point, there was no turning back, no stepping away, only moving forward into whatever waited on the other side of the secret. And as the night fully settled over Fairmont Crest, one thing became clear between them without needing to be said aloud. Leslie had started something, but she wasn't the only one playing the game anymore.